I'm going to quickly start with the land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. I'm extremely thankful to the organizing committee, awesome people, and in particular the invitation I got from Taylor Webb to participate in this, but also the whole theme across January until March. This is super exciting, and I'm happy to be part of the first workshop here. So I'll be talking about human versus AI creativity. And I've also been thinking a lot about intersections between the notion of reasoning and the notion of creativity. And I'd be happy to hear more, especially from the experts here, in terms of reasoning and how that connects. I think there's an interesting field to explore there. But if I had to summarize all of my talk today into two pictures, I'll start with this one. This is the first one, talking about human versus machine creativity. Seeing this more as a competition. Have we been beaten already by machines in terms of creative output? Or is it something more like this? Is there some sort of like soft competition, but at the same time working together is bringing up new ideas? And as the spoiler, yeah, this is what I think. Yeah, happy to report that the paper that I'll be talking about today just got published last week in Scientific Reports and has been received a lot of coverage since last week. By the media, obviously because this is something that interests a lot of people. The idea that creativity is something so deeply human is different from, for example, seeing that we've been beaten by the abilities of machines to do math, for instance. Somehow we feel, of course, a machine is going to be good at math. But when we start talking about creativity, if we talk about topics that maybe touch upon emotions, we know emotions are probably very important for artistic creativity. We are in a field where we feel that that's something that is so deeply human, and we might be bothered or intrigued or maybe annoyed by the fact that we're seeing on some specific tests machines catching up with human level performance. So some of this work started a couple of years back when I went to do a sabbatical at USC in Los Angeles. Of course, my aim was to become a movie star. That did not work out. But I started working with people from the cinema department at USC. And we organized some workshops exploring the idea of how is generative AI changing the field of cinema and in general the field of creative industries. And so the promise was that AI is going to allow machines to perform innovative, imaginative, and creative tasks. And this notion of creativity compared to some of the other benchmarks is something that has been less explored and something that is also quite frightening. And again, when we were out in LA, there was a lot of discussions about, in particular in the movie industry, there was a strike back then of the writers, and there was a huge concern about how AI is dramatically going to change the field and the problem it poses and the fact that it might be replacing human labor. And so this brings back again the question of, okay, if the output of some of these Gen AI systems seems creative, is it really creative? How do we define creativity? And actually, how do we measure it? And so in all of the LLMs that keep coming out every week at this stage, one of the claims that are made, of course, by the marketing team is this is yet the most creative LLM released. But compared to some of the other aspects of performance of LLMs that you can see on leaderboards, there's no really agreed upon metric to measure the creativity and what type of creativity are we really interested in when we're talking about Gen AI. Measuring creative behavior is difficult with humans, so probably arguably even more so in machines, right? And so this is, and as I said, the creative capacities are rarely scrutinized in some of these LLMs. It's very rare. Most of the time, we're looking at things like the SAT, the bar exam, medical licensing, and also, as you know, a lot of reasoning tests. Let's go one step back, and this is one of the exciting things about this project. It's real collaboration between people from interdisciplinary fields. The question is, okay, well, let's take one step back. How do we even measure creativity? So we turned to creativity science and looked at what are the metrics, what are the tests that people use to explore the creativity in humans before we can start to see how do we want to go on about this if we want to do this in machines. And so there's a large list. This is just some examples of tests that are standard in the field that are used. I'd like to tell you about one of them, the alternative uses task, the AUT. This is a standard task where you give someone an object, and you say, if you had a paperclip, or if you had a banana, or if you had a pencil, try to come up with as many uses, different uses of that same object in different ways. What would you do with it? How would you transform it to make it do different things? Then the output is evaluated by experts that go through it and then give a rating of the creativity of the answers, right? How many answers, how divergent, how creative, and how different. So this is just an example to say most of these creativity tests are actually quite difficult and time-consuming, and also rely a lot on subjective measures of the raters, right? You can have multiple raters, they might have different opinions about how creative a response is. And so this is now the point where I can introduce you to the DAT, the DAT. What's the DAT? It stands for Divergent Association Task. And timing was perfect. This came out in 2021, a paper led by Jay Olson in Toronto. And it's a very simple task to measure creativity and specifically the divergent aspect of creativity. And I'll talk about divergent versus convergent later on. But the nice thing about this is that the way the DAT works is that you ask somebody to give you 10 words, and these 10 words need to be as different from one another as possible in terms of their semantics, in terms of their meaning, right? So typically, if you say cat, you would not follow up with dog, because the semantic distance between the two is so small, right? They're too close to one another. You would like to find words that are largely separated. So the instruction is the following. Please write 10 words that are as different from each other as possible in all meanings and uses of the word. And there's a small set of rules like use only single words, only nouns, no proper nouns, no specialized vocab. Think of the words on your own. So just don't look around you and just try to pick up objects around you. And you have 4 minutes to complete the task. Now, I'm just going to show you here some examples. This is a low score. You can see the words arm, eyes, feet, hand, head, leg, body. Obviously, the semantic distance, the average semantic distance between all the couple of words here is going to be low. Average, you have bag, bee, burger, feast, office, shoes, tree. A high score, hippo, jumper, machinery, prickle, tickets, tomato, violin. These words are further away from each other, gives you a high score. So this is great news for multiple reasons. First of all, one super interesting thing about the DAT, which was reported in the PNS paper by Jay Olson, is that, of course, they asked individuals to do also a battery of standard tests of creativity. And then they correlated how well the DAT correlates to these other tests and found a high correlation. In other words, a simple test asking people to give you 10 words ends up giving you a score that correlates highly with these more elaborate time-consuming tests. Okay, so this is already good news that we say, okay, well, we could take this as a proxy. We don't need to do all these other tests. And actually, this test has been largely adopted by industry, and the website that Jay put in place has now close to 1 million data points of people that have been using this over the years. The other great news is asking an individual to give you 10 words is a perfect test that you can do with an LLM. That's what LLMs do. They give you words. So we can do this with an LLM. And so this was a couple of years ago with Antoine Belmar and François Lespinasse. We were brainstorming about this and we said, yes, this is what we should actually do with LLM. Are you asking? Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have a question. So, of course, there were studies showing that this test correlates with the other tests in humans, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they correlate with the other tests in LLM.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can get back to this, for sure. This is why we do not do only DATs with the LLMs. And so the DAT is simple and fast. It's ideally suited for both humans and chatbots and produces creativity scores that correlate, as I was saying, with more intricate or elaborate tests of divergent thinking. So the plan is we got data in collaboration with Jay Olson, whose website, as I said, had now many, many participants. We took 100,000 participants, the DAT scores from these participants, and we put together a plan to explore, using the same tests, a wide range of LLMs. This is just a snapshot of some of them. We did more than this. So we had Gemini, of course, and ChatGPT, and a few other ones, including Llama, Vicuña, Pythia, and so on, Stability AI at the time. This was done, started this work about 2 years ago. So yeah, here's a list that also in the paper of some of the properties of the different models that we tested. Now, I'm just going to give you some, this is I think I prepared this slide when I was invited to give a talk about this at the French embassy in LA back during my sabbatical. So this is why this looks a little bit goofy. But this is basically the human score. Here, the mean is around 80 something. This is the result for the Claude model that we used at the time. Again, this was about a year and a half ago. GPT-3. And normally here I have a drum roll and get people all excited. Is GPT-4 going to beat humans or not? And I guess if I'm talking here today that most of you know that the answer is going to be yes. And this is GPT-4, okay? So a lot of people thought this is probably bad news because is this proof that indeed machines have now surpassed human creativity and we can all relax and maybe quit trying to be as creative as possible and let the machines do that and we can maybe just relax and do something else? Maybe it's time for us to be less stressed about how creative we are supposed to be. This is here an overview of the scores of many multiple LLMs. The human one is the gray. I don't know, can I have a pointer here? I'm not sure if the point. Anyway, so the gray bar is the score of humans, and you can see the different scores here. And we looked at also pairwise contrast between the different LLMs. An interesting thing is to look at the words that come up. Because obviously each time it's a new start, but it turns out that many of these LLMs, they have a favorite series of words they're going to start with. So, for example, if you look at GPT-4, the most frequent word that came up in the list of 10, because obviously we asked the machine to do this over and over again. So we had, I think, over 100 or 200 repetitions for each one of these LLMs so that we had something more robust. Microscope, followed by elephant and volcano.
Did you ask humans to repeat the test over and over again?
We do have humans that have repeated the test, but not in the study.
How is this a valid comparison? If you think about it, you've done it 100 times, and you're going to think about it.
Well, yes, good point. But the minor difference is memory, right? Humans have memory of what they asked did just before. We restart the LLMs each time from scratch, so there's no prior memory. So it's as if it's a clean slot.
Except 100 times they do it over and over.
No, but they don't know they've done it. Yeah. So there's zero memory of the last. It's like a new instantiation of the machine, if you will. But if you look at the words that the humans come up with, actually quite boring, to be honest. The first word is like car, tree, dog, book, water, cat, so on and so forth. So yes, quite boring, but a lot of things to be discussed here. First of all, is this creative or just random? So if you just ask the machine to give you 10 words randomly, you get different responses than if you ask the machine the exact instruction we gave humans, which is try to find 10 words that are as different from one another as possible, and the answer is yes. The LLMs are trying to do that because their scores are higher when they follow the instruction rather than just give you 10 random words. I'm trying to go fast because there's a lot more to unpack in the paper, but some of the things that I think might be interesting to share is this idea of, okay, can we modulate the creative output of the LLMs, in particular using some of the hyperparameters. And one that is particularly interesting is temperature. And I'm sure most of you know here about temperature in LLM, but basically the lower the temperature, the more deterministic, the more predictable the output. It's going to just pick the most probable next word that's going to follow in a sentence, let's say. But if you increase the temperature, now the system has more random in it, and it's going to be picking maybe not the next most probable word, but it has a probability of words that are less deterministic in this sense. So you could imagine that if you increase the temperature of an LLM, like somebody on high fever that might start to hallucinate, that all of a sudden the output might be more creative. To the extent that if the temperature is really high, the output is even incoherent and maybe even not even following the instructions. Okay? And this is actually what we saw. So I'm going to go quickly through this. This is GPT's performance on the DAT for low temperature, mid temperature, and high temperature. Of course, many repetitions. And we see that there is a tendency to have higher scores on the DAT if you increase the temperature of your LLM. We also looked at the words that came out, the distribution of the words, and you can see for low temperature, it's picking up the same words more often. So there's more regularity and frequency. For example, microscope is coming up really very often. But if you go to higher temperatures, some of these high words like elephant and microscope are still there, but they're less frequent because it's sampling from a wider option of words each time. Now, we explored different linguistic strategies. What happens, because we humans, when we're doing this task, different people might use different strategies. Some people might be thinking about the roots, etymology of the of the words to try and like have more diversity, or trying to think in terms of opposition. So I just mentioned 2 examples here. Using the etymology of the word does increase the DAT score for GPT, in this case GPT-4. Using opposition does not, and that makes sense, right? Using opposition actually lowers, it's below control. Opposition is, for example, if you would say hot and then you would follow up with cold. This does not increase your DAT score. On the contrary, the hot and cold are very close semantically, so it decreases your score. And then we went on to exploring other types of text, now going beyond the DAT score. We had 3 types of text. We looked at haikus. These are poems in 3 lines from a Japanese tradition. We also looked at short fiction, and we looked at film movie synopsis. And just to give you an example of some of the results, here we use what we call the divergent semantic integration measure, which is doing something similar to what the DAT was doing, but now we're looking at semantic distance between pairs of words across different sentences. And here again, we see that the mean result of humans is higher, although we are seeing an increase in the score from GPT-3 to GPT-4. I'm not going to go into the details. We use some metrics like impulsive complexity to try and see, to assess also the complexity of the output and things like this. That was for the haikus. But now I'm just going to take one step back and go back to something that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, where basically revealing that it seems like GPT-4 and others have surpassed human performance on the DAT. And I'm sure some of you were thinking of that when they saw the results, like, well, that's the average score of humans, right? So that's over 100,000 people. If you take the mean, the machines are better. Probably the mean of the 100,000 people, those are not people necessarily that are in the creative industries job. Those are not necessarily our painters and our writers, designers and architects, or people making movies for that matter. So the question is, what about the more creative humans? If we take that segment, how do they fare compared to the machines? And this is why here you see the result for the 100,000, the whole sample of humans. But if we take the top 50%, the top 25%, or the top 10%, the mean of those, so the mean of this sub-segment of the more creatives has a DAT score here that is higher than the ones we had in any of the mean results of the LLMs. And so this, of course, was the pitch that what the University of Montreal chose when they did the press announcement saying, well, LLMs surpass the mean of human performance, but they do not surpass the performance of the most creative humans, which I think is fair for now. Okay, so apparently AI can perform better than humans on some creativity tests, on average, and if we're comparing to the average of the human population, it can write science fiction and poetry with some analysis showing that its complexity and its creative output is increasing as the models become more and more interesting. It can create games, music, animations, films, you know all of this. Still the question remains, is AI creative? And this is now bordering on more of a social sciences or more of a philosophical question. Wait a second, what is creativity, first of all? How do we really define this? And I think this is something, and some of you who have heard me talk about this before know that I think this is one of the things that is really exciting about AI research nowadays, and what we're seeing is that often AI holds a mirror back to us humans when we ask the question, what are the chances that AI becomes conscious? A lot of heated debate, and then people say, well, how do we define consciousness, or how do we measure it? And then people say, maybe we're not 100% sure yet how we even do that in humans. So we go back to the drawing board and try to see, okay, what do we know about consciousness? What do philosophers tell us about consciousness? What do neuroscientists tell us about consciousness, and so on and so forth? And I think this is also the case for creativity. So 3 answers to this question is, probably maybe you have another one, but I'm just going to suggest 3 types of answers to the question, is AI creative? There's the first answer, which is to say no. AI is just a tool in the creative process. So it's not itself creative, right? It's a tool. It's going to be like your calculator or something that's a tool to do calculus. This is a tool that's going to help you be creative. Second, options say yes, actually, the novelty and the aesthetics of and the utility of AI outputs is actually a sign of creativity. And just to pause here for a second, I think there's an interesting debate to be had, and this is very subjective. If you walk into a museum and you see a huge painting or a sculpture, or if you open up a book and there's a poem that you read, if you feel touched by it, if you feel that, oh, this is actually really amazing, what would your opinion about that change if you were told right afterwards, oh, interesting that you say that, this is actually AI generated? People have different opinions with regards to this. Some people will say, yeah, that's fine. If I was touched, I was genuinely touched. So I'm okay if I found something to be beautiful. If I walk into my lounge in the morning to get my coffee and there's this huge painting that makes me feel good, even if I know it was AI, maybe that's perfectly fine. Others will say, no, if I go to a museum or if I'm reading a poem, I want the human behind it. I want to know why this was written or why this was painted in this way. So it's really important for me to know what type of human emotion, joy, suffering went into creating the piece of art. And I think we probably would agree that that's a subjective position, and each one of us might have their own position on this. Okay, so the third answer now is the question is not really interesting to see is AI per se creative or not. We need to think more about creative synergies between humans and machines. What can we do together? And having AIs in the loop for the creative process is probably something, A, partly unavoidable. I hope it is avoidable because I hope it stays a choice. With the pressures of the industry, the pressure on production, even for artists and for creatives, it's become increasingly difficult to say, no, we're not using AI. Because if everybody else is, then if that's how you're making a living, you might get into trouble if you don't. And I think that's a problem that we should also discuss. So I mentioned earlier, when talking about creativity, there's this, I mentioned divergent creativity, and I didn't really explain the link between divergent and convergent. Basically, in a lot of work on creativity, the idea is to say, well, we have two components of the creative process. The first one is divergent, so that you diverge, and step two is you converge. In the divergent creative process, it's the ideation process. This is where you're generating different options, different ideas, different points of view, different possibilities. So if you're, for example, coming up with a logo, that's the part where you'll be exploring a large space of options of what this logo could be like. And then afterwards, you come to the convergent part, which is where you're evaluating the value of each one of these options, and you try to converge onto what seems to be the best option you believe for a number of criteria, be it what the client was asking you to do, or what you think is most aesthetically pleasing, or which fits exactly the solution to the problem that you were thinking of. And maybe just another point here, a lot of the things that we're talking about here, I think also apply more generally to things we call problem solving, right? Because, and this is a discussion I had with Joshua about this, where, so Joshua was saying some of the things he's interested in about creativity is the creativity of, for example, agents in a reinforcement learning environment, or the creativity of solutions to a problem, or creativity in terms of learning and things like this. I think a lot of these concepts here relate to that. And so there is this idea that, for example, trying to come up with 10 words that are maximally different from one another, that can be seen as a problem. And what you're trying to do is solve that problem with these different concepts of divergent and then convergent creativity. So the first part, ideation, there's no judgment. It's imaginative and it's free. And the quantity of the ideas that come up is important. And in the second one, this is where you're doing a disciplined and intellectual judgment to try and come up with what you think is the best solution. So what is the take-home message for this part? There's empirical evidence for the enhanced divergent creativity achieved by current LLMs, as measured by, for example, the DAT, the Divergent Association Task. The benchmarking framework that we proposed in this study opens up new paths for the development potentially of more creative LLMs. For example, you could incorporate creativity metrics into the fine-tuning phase of an LLM. Is that cheating? I'll get back to that in a second. Thirdly, we still see that highly creative individuals still outperform LLMs on these specific divergent association tasks. Now, I quickly want to say something about the tasks themselves. And I think what I'm going to say applies to all benchmarking approaches for LLMs. One issue we ran into, obviously, because as you know, there's like the speed at which these LLMs are being developed and the fact that every couple of months or couple of weeks, there is yet the update version of any of these tools that you're trying to evaluate. Of course, we started off with GPT-3 at the very beginning and then super excited when GPT-4 came out. So we said, okay, we need to redo analysis with GPT-4 and so on and so forth. And the same thing happened with Claude and with Gemini and so on. We kept trying to update before we get our paper published. The point is that now with the training of these newer models, the DAT test, and this is probably a question that some of you have in your minds, the DAT test came out in 2021. So you're going to find traces of performances on the DAT test on the internet. And so if you're using a model that has seen maybe very good examples of highly performing people on the DAT, then there might be access to some data that's going to influence, at least to some extent, its output. And so this is something that we clearly, I think, saw with, for example, Llama 3, again, with high performances on the DAT, but the training data and the cutoff time of the training data that went into Llama 3 went beyond the release of the DAT tool. And so there are issues to be handled there. And so this is why, and we've seen this in many LLM developments where people give you the scores on many standard tests, but that somehow there's something circular there. When you know you're going to release your approach, especially if you're a company, of course you are optimizing for a number of tests that you think are going to be super important. And so there is an issue of, I think, not only for creativity, but all benchmarking tests in LLMs, the fact that at some point, if you're fine-tuning specifically for them, of course you're going to get high scores on that, but how well does it generalize to some other test that is related, but maybe you did not take into account in your development of your LLM. And so this brings me, okay, I'll come back to that later, but I think there might be an interesting need to develop dynamic benchmarking tools that are good at assessing something, for example, creativity, but are nowhere to be found on the internet or in the training data that can actually be developed on the fly when you're running this. But I'll get back to that later. I'm not quite sure how much time I have. Maybe somebody can help me out here, just to make sure. Do I have another, like?
We'll start the discussion at 11:30. So.
And now is 30 minutes? 13. Perfect. That's exactly the time I need. Perfect. Okay. So because I'm a computational and cognitive neuroscientist, so we're doing AI and neuroscience together, there's another side of the research in our lab that's actually looking at creativity in humans, behaviorally, but also by measuring brain activity in individuals. And one of the tasks that we discovered is really interesting, we feel, in exploring creative capacities, say task or phenomenon, is what we call pareidolia. Pareidolia is typically, for those of you, is this a word that some people are familiar with? Maybe raise your hand if you've heard pareidolia before. Yes, a few. Basically, this is when you're looking up at the sky, you see all these clouds, and you start seeing objects in cloud. Probably there's no bus in the sky, or there's no teddy bear in the sky, but your brain is actually piecing things together and generating these constructs out of an ambiguous stimulus. So this is what happens in pareidolia. You'd be walking in the street and you see maybe in the trunk of a tree, you could see a face looking back at you. There's no face probably in the tree, I hope. But that's what you feel, okay? That's pareidolia. And one of the questions we ask is, are more creatives, people that have larger creative abilities, more prone to experience this? If you're a very creative person, and you look up at the sky, are you seeing 6, 7, 8 different constructs? And if you're less creative, do you look up and say, well, I can barely see, I see clouds. So this was the question we asked, and here are some nice examples, I think, of pareidolia. None of these, again, depending on what drugs you're taking, but none of these are actually real. This is Antoine Belmar, a postdoc in the lab, a PhD in the lab at the time, who's now a postdoc. And so what we did is we generated, using fractals, stimuli that are ambiguous, with different levels of fractal dimension, 1.9 down to 1.1. And we asked individuals to tell us how many objects are they seeing and what they're seeing. And we did with them many tests of creativity, including the DAT, the DAT. And we tried to see, is there a correlation between the experience of pareidolia on one hand and their scores on creativity tests? And that's exactly what we found, and that was described in a paper published in 2022 over there. And then if you're interested in this relationship between divergent perception and sensory flexibility. We call it sensory flexibility because sometimes if you're looking at an object, it might be difficult to then detach from that concept. If you're seeing something in the sky, afterwards it might be difficult to try and find something else, right? And so cognitive flexibility or sensory flexibility in this case might be something that goes hand in hand with your creative abilities. The ability to just reinterpret the same image over and over again in different ways. And so if you're interested in that, Antoine wrote a magnificent review published last year in Creative Behavior. Okay, so I'm going to finish with 3 questions that I'm personally interested in, and I'd like to maybe have discussions with you on some of these. First one, I talked a lot today about divergent creativity. The metric we had is for that, divergent creativity. We're still in need of maybe an interesting way of exploring convergent creativity in LLMs and comparing that to humans. I briefly mentioned the idea of maybe dynamic tests, something where we can probe the creativity of an LLM on a test for which there's no trace on the internet, there will be no trace in the learning data that has been used to pre-train the algorithms. And so maybe we can come up with something that actually is generated on the fly, that obeys a certain number of rules, that correlates with scores of others, but that actually just there's nothing that exists that would allow the machine to go, let's say, quote unquote, cheat to get the result. And finally, and this is also thanks to this symposium, I've been thinking about the relationships between reasoning and creativity. And clearly reasoning will come into both parts, I think divergent, but also in the convergent, maybe more so in the convergent, but maybe also just in the divergent as well, I don't know. So these are things that I think are interesting to discuss. With that, I hope it did not go over time. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Karim. You've actually, I think, given us even more time back, so that's great. We can have an extended discussion. I thought it was really striking that, you and Noah, despite giving sort of talks on different topics like creativity and reasoning, you kind of endeavor to do something really similar, taking a very big, ambitious idea, trying to formalize it, perhaps even more challengingly, trying to measure it. And I think you've left us open to discuss both, what are the missing ingredients, what are ingredients that seem to be there in LLMs. And so I think we can have a really interesting discussion. And so I invite the audience to now ask some questions to kick us off. Alona, your hand went up first. Oh, and also Ben, if you could join Karim up front, that would be awesome. So Ben is going to take the place of Noah and ask him about all the great work that Ben participated in.
I'll start with a question for Karim. This is really interesting work. I recently spoke to Kate Compton, who's well known in the AI and creativity for digital games, about her thoughts on creativity and AI. And she completely rebuked the question and was like, it's not interesting because AI can't have intent. And the part of creativity that makes it interesting is intent. And when you see a piece of art and it touches you, it's like the connection of intent rather than the surface form. And so since AI, so what do you think of that? And do you think AI could ever have intent? Does AI have intent?
So thank you, Alona, 100%. So I agree exactly with what Kate said. And this is, I've been on the radio since last week a couple of times and people ask this question. And that's exactly my point. For me personally, but this is why I said subjective, because I want to leave open the fact that some people might say a piece of art can touch me, I can engage with it with zero information about intent and not even wanting to know. And I respect that. I personally like to know why this came about, what was the intent, and because I see that as a form of communication and an expression of emotions, but also of thoughts, ideas. Then the question becomes, okay, well, can the machine have intent? And I think, and then the larger question from intent, the jump is really close to talk about consciousness, and we have Simon here. We've been talking about these questions quite a bit. I think we need to remember that Gen AI by itself, it exists. It won't all of a sudden generate an image or a movie on your computer by itself if you're not prompting it to do anything. So at minimum, there's going to be some interaction. Now, again, exactly like creativity, we get to the point, this is why I like the mirror analogy, we'll say, okay, how do you want to define intent so that we can continue this discussion? Is intent a voluntary action that starts from probably somewhere? If you have intent, I mean, we start to talk about determinism here. This is why it quickly moving. This is why we need more philosophers in our discussions. What is intent? Probably it's not something that you start from scratch when you intend to share information with someone, or if you want to do something, or if you decide you're going to apply for a new grant. There's something that has led you to that. And I think the art is the same way. And so when comparing the processes, some people say, well, machines can put stuff together. All of that's going to be mainstream stuff because it's stuff that existed. Okay, they combine it, but it's all regurgitating stuff that humans have done already because that's how it learned. So there's nothing really, there's no spark of genius there. Humans do that. And then when you think about it, you can question that and say, is that true? Are you, as a human, able to put things together that you've never seen before? No. Your lived experience, everything you've been through, everything you've watched, you've thought about, you've seen, or you've felt in your body, these are things that are going to inform whatever you're going to do at any moment in time, actually, including when you're trying to come up with a creative idea. So we do the same thing. So that demystifies, and it's a lesson of humility maybe for us, thinking we're so special because we have this creative sparks of geniuses, but maybe we're not that special. But still, the sticky point remains, I think, intentionality. And I want to stop there because I can go on for ages on this, but I'd be happy to talk more about this. Yeah.
Really interesting. I'm gonna, because I have the mic, I'll quickly indulge myself and ask a question. This one is for Ben. When Noah was talking about your work about free-ended or open-ended generation and so forth, it got me thinking a little bit about the nature of maybe humans to completely invent new concepts and variables as they reason. And I was wondering, is this a missing ingredient that you see for reasoning in LLMs, or have you seen some evidence that they too have some notion of totally being able to invent concepts that they need that they maybe haven't even seen in their training data?
Yeah, so just from reading a bunch of chains of thought, I haven't seen models define new terms and then use them in the course of a chain of thought. There's a question of maybe as you're training a model to do better at reasoning tasks via reinforcement learning, the meanings of words drift enough that you might say oh, the model invents new concepts by changing how the words work. But I would say that ability to come up with new concepts is mostly missing from current reasoning models. I've thought a bit about how this happens in humans, and I think finding a good abstraction is a really hard problem. I think it's really in culture that we get a nice library of abstractions that we can draw upon. What one person needs to find a good abstraction and then just tell everyone else about it, and then over generations we develop libraries of tactics and ideas and such. So I think generally when you optimize a model to reason well, you don't see it come up with new concepts, but also if we're thinking of that as training an individual to reason, maybe we shouldn't expect it to do that.
It's really interesting. I love the idea of abstraction, and I could ask many questions about this, but I will pass the mic to somebody else. I think you had your hand up first, and then I'll get to you.
How can you explain in your experiment that you ask LLMs to generate 10 random words and microscope words came up so many times?
Statistics, I would say, of the learning. So these are the random ones we asked random, but we also asked them to try and find words that comply with the instruction that are further from. But yes, I think this is the model that we use. Whatever the pre-training data that has been gone into it, and it's an interesting question to see why it's so diverse, and this is maybe a question to some of the more LLM experts than I am here. Maybe Siva or maybe somebody else has a guess on this. But for sure, if you start again from scratch, the same LLM
has access to thousands of words.
Yes, it must be the way the distribution, the statistics of the learned data. Yeah.
So my question is about, so the DAT is elegant and scalable, obviously, but it's also a Western lexical proxy built on embedding space, semantic distance. So how do you think about cultural linguistic bias and construct validity, especially for indigenous or code switching contexts, where creativity may be relational, story protocol, or land-based? And would you consider maybe a dual metric approach that pairs objective divergence with community ground evaluation to define ground truth? Thank you.
Thank you so much for asking this. Maybe I didn't emphasize enough. Clearly, this is one facet of creativity and is connected to the English language. Out of the 100,000 people that we selected, we went with people that are most likely to be mother tongue, because, as I said, the database was larger than that. So primarily UK, US, Australia, New Zealand, which obviously also have indigenous languages that are not accounted for with this type of test. So it is a problem. Again, it's also looking at divergent part of, so it's a subset of what we call creativity and a subset of what we refer to as the human population, of course. So this is just a beginning, and we already have the issue of LLM. And everything you said, I think, also applies to, in general, the way LLMs are being built nowadays. So I'm lucky to be involved in a consortium and an NFRF initiative that's called Abundant Intelligences, where we're thinking about indigenous epistemologies and how that relates to AI and how that can inform better, broader definition of AI. And so there's a lot of discussions also about cultural aspects and creativity. So this is the very beginning, and this is definitely an urgent matter to try and see how this can be explored with different definitions or components of what we call creative behavior. 100%.
Great, thank you. Allison, you were next.
Just a comment about Ben's response, which is that developing new concepts and conceptual change is something that we know that children do, 2, 3, 4-year-olds do, and there's a whole literature about it. And I think the TLDR is no one knows how they do it. If you wanted to say what's the sort of unsolved problem about cognitive development, figuring out conceptual change is the most important one. So that it's still a problem, but I think it doesn't just depend on having a particular rich cultural context. In Karim, I'm trying to articulate this the best I can. Let me start with a story. I remember hearing Merce Cunningham talking about the aleatory methods that he and John Cage used, right? Where you would use the I Ching and then you would use it to try to generate musical possibilities or dance possibilities. And someone said, that seems so strange. Like, why would you think that doing something random would help you to solve the problem? And he said, well, of course, it's not the I Ching that's solving the problem. It's that when I use the random sample, I can get a range of ideas, most of which are terrible, but then I could decide, because I'm a practiced choreographer and because my dancers are so practiced, they won't usually go to one of these strange movements, and sometimes that turns out to be the interesting movement that I actually want to use. And it seems to me that there's a kind of, and it's an interesting fact that these cultural methods for generating randomness actually are important, and there's a lot of them. So you could think about things like oracles, for example, or the I Ching itself is a way of, why does this stupid random thing that obviously couldn't be telling you something, why does that seem useful to people? Is it just that is it just a delusion, or is it because in fact what it's doing is giving you a way of generating divergence in the sense of sentences or words. So it seems to me like that could be a kind of analogy. And in terms of your point about the subjective value of art, it's a commonplace that Marcel Duchamp takes a urinal and puts it in the museum, and now you think about it in different kinds of ways. It's not at all clear that in fact, I think good art historians would say the idea that somehow the intent of the artist is the central thing is just wrong, especially for describing modern art, or someone like there's lots of examples of people using these kind of chance generation methods. But I think that's a different question. The question is, if you think about it as there's a culturally determined method that we have, a technology we have for doing things like generating divergence, it seems like that is in fact something that we've often used, and that's very helpful in doing the convergent creativity, which is in a sense the thing that we really want to do. I mean, another way of putting this question is, think about the difference that having print makes to the kind of creative work that you can do, both for good or for ill. So think about the difference between the oral tradition, where you are repeating with variations the Homeric epics over many, many times, versus what happens when you have print. That both means that you're not repeating it differently. Now you have a single version of it, but it means that you have many, many different single versions of it. I think that those kind of analogies might be helpful in trying to understand what's going on.
100%. This is so exciting. So everything you said. I'm maybe going to pick up on just one, two quick things. I think so. Yes, the randomness that people. This is what I alluded to with the temperature. That's, I think, a perfect example, right? You increase the temperature, you allow yourself to the extent of, if the temperature is way too high, the output of the LLM is incoherent and it's not even adapting to the instruction. But there's a sweet spot there where you can increase the temperature but still have output that follows the rules. But even there, the question of randomness, I'd love to discuss randomness. What is randomness? Does it exist? Are we actually, as humans, capable of producing randomness? I don't think so, unless we redefine it in a way that it becomes a human thing. So that's one thing. And then there's the intentionality. The Marcel Duchamp example is perfect. Some people will say, well, there's no intention, there's no message intentionality there. Dadaism was actually against these messages, but at the same time, it was disruptive. So going against the system by saying we're going to go against the Impressionists and we're just going to cut out letters and write poems that mean nothing, or put a urinary in a museum, that's a statement. So is that void of intention? I don't think so. There is intention there, which is disruptive, and a statement about what art is and should be, and going against some elitist form of art. So I think by looking at these LLMs in this way, we are asking questions that are relevant way beyond just the LLMs, in terms of like re-exploring what are the processes that we humans do when we are engaged in creative processes. So.
Yeah, and I also want, in terms of the two talks, I thought there's an interesting kind of symmetry, in the sense that what the reasoning cases are doing is really narrowing and constraining the range of alternatives that you can produce, and the divergent cases are increasing the range of alternatives that you can produce. And clearly you can train an LLM to do one of those or the other. It's an interesting question about how human intelligence involves both of those processes, and how they're how they're related to what the outcome.
Yeah, I don't know what you think. This is why I was also like reasoning. I would say maybe is closer to the convergent component, but that might not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, there's actually a result that I was thinking about during your talk, Karim, which is the poems generated by base models, or at least by the base llama model. Humans rate as more original than the poems generated by instruct optimized and RLHF models. So it seems like, and also if you just ask a model, generate a random number, if you take a model that's optimized to follow instructions, it'll say 7 like all the time. And if you take the base model, it will generate more or less a uniform distribution over numbers. And so it seems like even when our goal isn't to narrow the range of responses, like what we do with reasoning models, if our goal is just to help models follow instructions or do things that humans like, we can still often have this side effect of narrowing the range of what models generate. You get like poems that follow these very strict rhyme patterns and like, I don't know, probably fit with like someone's idea of what a poem should look like, maybe who hasn't read a ton of poetry, whereas the base models have a wider distribution of outputs.
Yeah, I think this is a good example, because in the haikus, these are the three-liners, Japanese-style poems. I think it's like 7, 10, and 7 syllables. There's a very specific rules, and most of the time it's about nature. What we saw is that the human ones were more creative. Not necessarily because the human writing those poems were more creative in their output, but actually it turns out when we asked the machine to generate haikus, it was following the rules. So it was about nature, largely about nature themes. Whereas the set of poems that were generated by humans, the haikus generated by humans, we realized on closer inspection, humans were taking more the liberty of using the same formalism or the format, but actually moved away from nature-related topics. And so that's why afterwards, when looking at the divergence in the complexity in the themes, turned out that the human was higher, partly because humans decided, yeah, standard haiku is most of the time about nature and flowers and scenery and so on. But you know what? I'm going to talk about emotions. Humans do that. The LLMs were following the rules. So that's also something else to take into account when we're comparing humans to machines. I think there was a question in the back.
Yeah, hand it off to Claire.
Hi, thanks both for the super interesting talks. So I have two thoughts that are related to both reasoning and creativity. First of all, I was wondering if you guys, I don't think so, are familiar with like this reasoning creativity trade-off that's been established in the sense that training on reasoning traces, like with STAR, that output entropy decreases, and that therefore, so this is basically what you guys were discussing, and yeah, there's a couple of papers out there on this kind of stuff, so that might be interesting to look at. And then I wanted to go, it's like a combination of things, because you have the product view of creativity and the process view. Like, what is the output and how is it done? And if you think about analogical reasoning, I kind of sometimes refer to it as creative reasoning, because you have to come up with something new given like an instance of A is to B, and then you need to figure out what goes with C in the same way. So you're going to come up with something new. And if we look at mechanistic interpretability work on analogical reasoning, there is some work that shows that perhaps in the residual stream, what we're doing is kind of that B minus A plus C. And now I'm wondering, what I'm thinking that's going on with on the DAT, which is easy to game the system if I grab a random word generator, or if even easier to game if I can just compute the semantic distances between my words while I'm trying to do it. So I'm thinking that maybe there's some vector arithmetic going on in the LLMs whenever they're doing this task, and that would point to a process that is, not creative, and that's like kind of like the Bowden way of thinking about whether it's a creative process versus not. And I was curious what you guys thought about that. On the one hand, in terms of mechanistic interpretability, maybe that's going on, and then the product versus process view in general.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I wonder with the DAT actually, how much of when someone does the DAT, do you think they're like deliberately thinking, what are ways in which words can be different? How can I select a set of 10 words that are going to be maximally different? Or do you think it's they're more or less having words sort of come to mind and saying them automatically?
So the test exists online. I think it's DAT. Creativity.com. So I encourage everyone, if you're curious, to try it out. It's really 2 to 4 minutes. But I think there's a lot of individual variability in the strategies. And also there's the impact which we don't have in the machine of time, right? Because the humans are given maximum 4 minutes. So even a human, if you gave them like 48 hours, they might continue updating the set by looking at, oh yes, I could actually say this, go back to the list, add this, where this is really further apart. And so there are ways of also human gaming that system, or as you said, looking for a random word generator. Or somebody asked us this question also in the past, what about a dictionary? Just take random words out of dictionary, then this is going to be. But those are not, they don't reflect the frequency of usage of those words in language, right? LLMs are based on language. So they learn from the actual language used by us humans or produced by us humans. So it does contain a lot of regularities or frequencies of appearances of words and connections of words and the semantic distances which define what a language model is, right? And so it's the navigation in that space, I think, where humans also are going to be navigating. So for some people, the available space at one moment in time is going to be larger, so you'll be navigating across larger distances, and others are going to be maybe trapped in more like well, if I think about this, the only other things I think about is maybe this. And so it's like a smaller distance of where you can navigate that space. And so I think this is where the instructions become really important, because if you gave an LLM access to semantic distances, like if you gave it glove or bird and say, well, go look in there for like most different words, obviously then it will use that. But in this case, we're asking it to, as a conversational agent, to do exactly what we ask in humans. Now, are those processes similar? I think by definition, they are not identical. Are there some similarities in the process? I hope. But at the end of the day, that's just a starting point, right? Because what you would ask is, well, how does the DAT compare onto other tasks that the LLM would do? In other words, if they perform highly on that, if we did now with them the AUT task, which is asking them, use a paperclip and tell me about maximum number of options that you could use a paperclip. And there is some work now showing that there is that generalization between DAT scores and uses, but we're still in language. So now how does that relate to generating a movie or generating images or generating a long fiction, not just a short fiction? So these are things that are up and coming, but so I think this is sort of like a starting point. I'm not sure it answers entirely the question, but it reflects the fact that we are at the starting point, so I can't answer the question 100%.
I actually wonder if you'd expect reasoning models to do better on the DAT than non-reasoning models, because you could imagine the model like coming up with candidate words in the reasoning trace, and like in principle it might have some way of computing the embedding distance between those words over the course of the reasoning trace, and then it could eventually settle on a set that has a high set of embedding distances. And I wonder also if those differences might reflect like humans who spend 10 minutes on the DAT versus humans who have to do the DAT in like 1 minute. Yeah, just
it'll be interesting also to see if what happens with the different models if you tell them do not use the semantic distances for this. Just the fact of prompting that, I'd be curious how many would actually use it. If you know, because you can't guarantee the adoption and the adherence 100% to your instruction, right? So it would be nice to see like who are the biggest liars among the LLMs if you ask them not to use a rule and then you figure out that they did use it somehow. I think
I don't know the cue. I'm just going to go kind of based on what I saw.
So a comment regarding the capacity for randomness of humans and the effect of intentionality. Perhaps from a different domain other than words, so in the visual arts, for example, if you go back in time and try to look at either correlations or fluctuations in art throughout time. If you look at early art, say in Renaissance or Islamic art, you find kind of two extremes. So in one case, you find super Poissonian fluctuations. To use a technical term, the patterns are blobby, more blobby than random. And on the other side, you find very regular patterns, which is, again, the opposite of random. Now, as you move forward in time, what you find is that these two extremes start to approach each other. So, and this is really interesting to look at, especially going into non-representational art. So for example, if you look at Lee Krasner or Pollock, they actually intentionally used processes that are chaotic, which means eventually look random. And this still appeals to us, and they were able to generate it.
Maybe also our representation of randomness, right? It's like our representation of what we think is random. So for Pollock, for example, in his art, he's not maybe seeking randomness, or he feels that this is maybe an act of random painting. But again, it can never be, in my opinion, 100% random. It's going to be constrained by many things, constrained by the body, constrained by his movements and his intentionality, and the mere fact that he wants to produce something random already makes it. But anyway, sorry, sure, I didn't want to interrupt, but go ahead.
No. Of course, these are valid points, but just this maybe another example where this is even more visible is the stripe paintings. So for example, Bridget Riley, she has a whole series of these vertical stripes. These are just paintings that are just vertical stripes. Now, if you do an analysis of the correlation between colors of the stripes, you see that there are very strong correlations. And actually, Riley has written about how she created the artwork, so you can actually go and check the intentionality of the correlations introduced. In contrast, Gerhard Richter is a German visual artist, and he created, again, stripes, vertical stripes, paintings of vertical stripes. And these are more fine. The technique is very different, but also if you look at correlations between stripe colors in his paintings, there you find something that is almost perfectly random. And both have an evocative effect. If you go, I have was fortunate enough to look at both of them, and both are evocative, right? So I'm wondering whether, of course, in what you showed, you're talking more about averages, right, and the mean or the median. But I guess maybe it would be interesting to examine also this role between intentional randomness versus accidental randomness in art.
100%. Yeah. So I think this goes back to, just briefly, because I know there are other questions, but this goes back to the idea of how important is intentionality, and important for whom? Is it important for the observer, or is it important for the artist? And in the case of a machine, what is intentionality? I think that's unresolved, or can it even exist? Specifically, to my knowledge, up to now, no machine will turn itself on, generate a prompt, unless it has been prompted to turn itself on and generate a prompt. So yeah, but I like the analogies with the uncorrelated versus correlated, and intentionality behind that. So I'd be happy to talk. Jonathan.
Hi, Karim. This is about creativity. I wanted to come back to the process versus product question that came up. So like intent is super interesting and super relevant. But another thing that, another way to maybe frame one of the like big philosophical questions here, which is also a legal question, is to look at the way copyright law looks at the issue. Because I mean, I'm thinking about this notion of transformative use, which is really important in the U.S. Kind of cases that are up right now. And so the phrase that's important, and it actually comes from a case about Two Live Crew. Like, so Two Live Crew did a parody song of Pretty Woman. And then there's this case, and the Supreme Court came up with this doctrine, and the doctrine is all about, you know, it's okay to, even for commercial purposes, produce something that is in some way derived from something else or a response to something else. But the principle is that it has to alter the original with new expression, meaning, or message. So what's interesting here is actually that it's the term intent doesn't quite come up. You can kind of circumvent that. But there is this question of new expression, meaning, or message. And one thing that's interesting about your result is that the way that you're kind of on the mean might be relevant. Like, it might be that in a sense, to the extent that we find that this is just sort of taking an average of human capacity, that is less new than if the process somehow permitted things that human outputs don't do.
Yes, I think so. First of all, there is again here, I don't want to be the guy that's always saying, well, define this before, but I think there's also, even the legal aspect you mentioned, the new expression and
meaning and message.
Those are arguably subjective, right? So I can argue a long time with someone on, like, is this modification, transformation, new meaning, or is it actually close enough to the original? So there might be a gray zone there. But to the last point you mentioned,
I was just wondering, one thought is whether the actual quantitative result could be relevant here. That, you know, whether it's, what we find is that the, you know, LLM performance is somehow in the middle, and therefore more of an average, as opposed to shows sparks of something that's really outlier. It's not obvious that it's relevant, but you might, you know, I can see ways to make up such an argument.
Yeah, I wanted to say something to your initial question and just escaped my mind. So, but yeah, I think so. I agree to that. I think we can move away. What we're seeing is that you can actually fine tune or you can modify the algorithm or the model to move away from average performances but I think here's the point. There's the idea of novelty or intentionality from the prompting is, for example, and this goes back to I think the idea of novelty and can we create new ideas. If the prompting, let's say, will ask an LLM to generate a methodology for, let's say, producing coffee, but embedding methodology that come from fuzzy logic. Okay. Now what you did is you took two concepts as a human that maybe had some form of divergent thinking, but you into this. But another fellow human might listen to you and say, oh, this makes no sense. How am I going to use fuzzy logic or genetic algorithms or genetic evolution algorithms into a process to make coffee? That's ridiculous, and I couldn't connect them. The thing is, what the machine, that will not tell you, no, I can't do this. It will come up with something. Now, if you ask it to do that 50 times, out of the 50, there might be some interesting ideas in there. Now, how would you define that? Is that a new idea that brought ideas together that have never been put together in the past, so that's novel? Is that creative? Or is that, again, just the result of the human prompting that said, bring these two things, I have no idea how I could do caffeine and fuzzy logic, but I'm going to submit this to you, LLM, come up with something, and I know you can't resist, but actually give me some ideas, some of them might work. So there is, and then the intentionality there is still on the human side, of course, I guess. But yeah.
I know Vincent has been waiting for a while to ask a question, so maybe we'll, if there's time, we could do yours and one more.
I felt the two talks were very related in an even another way, because creativity, you said, is like two phases, divergent and then convergent. But also the creative process is doing this in a loop and then disassembling and reassembling different parts and having new ideas, exploring new ideas from the suggestions that you have. And that feels very much connected to like the backtracking in the chain of thought reasoning. And I feel like, especially in the game of 24, it's exactly a creative process, but a very constrained creative process, but having to have ideation on new ways of combining the numbers and then working it out, see it doesn't work, but seeing different options come up from that. So if I was curious if you could like have a talk about this.
Absolutely. I'll just say one thing. I think temperature, for example, I don't know if you tried this, changing the temperature on LLMs, doing the task of the 24. Things like that would increase the parallel between these two approaches. So I agree 100%. Maybe I'll let you, I've talked enough, so maybe I'll let you take that question, but I think it's interesting.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think in general, with reasoning models, if you let the temperature go too low, it gets stuck in a loop. It will like propose something and then say, oh, that doesn't quite work. And then, but it will like then propose the same thing, or it will find some way of like getting stuck. If you turn up the temperature a little bit, you have it propose a larger variety of things. It explores more ideas and generally does better. Yeah, I think there's something similar in that like one of the other cognitive behaviors in Kanishk's paper is verification. So check your work, and so a rough loop for what reasoning traces look like in Game of 24 is like propose something, verify it. If it doesn't work, backtrack, propose, verify. Though that seems like the key sort of set of behaviors you need. And it does seem similar to a creative process of come up with something, decide whether I like it. If I don't, maybe backtrack, change something about it. Yeah, I guess that the general like loop of generating things and verifying or doing a vibe check on them is, I think, the same.
Yeah, and I think related to this question, I was just thinking right now, I like these debates because I was just trying to figure out, I don't know what all of you think, is creativity a subset of reasoning? Is that the bigger umbrella? Or is creativity the larger umbrella? Is reasoning one of the components? I think again, depending on how we define these, it might be interesting to think about that way. Because some people might say, well, it's not a surprise that in the creative process, there are similarities with reasoning. We're using the same cognitive processes to a large extent in both things when we're solving a problem, right? The definition, and for many people that's the boring definition of creativity, is solving a problem in an original, new, and useful way. So coming up with a solution that is both new, has not been done before, but is actually useful. That's not necessarily how artists think about creativity, right? But that is a definition that is really close to reasoning, right? You have something logical, you're trying to come up with a solution, and it does combine these multiple steps. And we see this in train of thought in particular, where you come up with something, then you go back forth between these two processes, and you can see that as going back and forth between divergent and convergent, maybe adding some steps of checking along the way.
So I think we'll end with one last question, and this will be from Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you for the great talks. I wanted to ask a question to understand better your comparison of the top 10%, 20% of humans to the models. I guess the question is motivated by the idea that, you know, obviously if you're selecting over a distribution, two random distributions, if you take the top of one, you'll get higher scores, right, than the other, even if they're equal. And so what I want to understand is related to the question earlier about the fact that you can't test, retest, sample the humans, right? It kind of seems to me that you might be sampling over two sources of variability for the humans, right, which is the within subject variability as well as the between subject variability. And so I wonder if similarly, the appropriate comparison would be to sample over not just the top 10% of models, or like, you know, not just compare to the top models, but say, okay, well, what if we took across the samples from the models, if you took the top 10%, do you still see the same kind of benefit?
Thank you for that question. This is something we thought about when writing up and on the manuscript. But so of course, if you take the 10%, you'll be comparing like the top performances of one single model, its best top 10% shots, to the 10% humans. And there's validity in doing that. The reason we decided not to, at least we did not include those results, is because we're thinking of like a real life situation. If you go on to ChatGPT or Gemini and you ask for a solution to a problem, you're going to get the default. You're not necessarily going to run it 100 or 1,000 times and then find a way of choosing the best solutions. So basically the idea was saying, well, if a person that scores on the mean of creativity, so goes on to use an LLM for a task, what's the comparison in terms of the outputs? Or if people in the creative industries, for instance, who feel most threatened right now about the rise of Gen AI, go and use, again, a default LLM with some tweaking. Probably they will not be running through an API 100 calls to the same system and trying to get the best options. But there would be a good, there are for different questions, you could want to look at that. From the distributions, I don't have the slides up here anymore, but they're in the paper, you can look at the distributions, it's way more heavy-tailed in humans. So the distributions in machines goes up and down like this, whereas in humans, it's going to do this, right? So you have way more performances that are higher up there. So even if you did take the 10% and the 10% in humans, chances are for some of the models, you'll still see the 10% humans mean of those be higher than the mean of the 10% in machines. But I'd be happy to talk more. I don't want to. Yeah. Hope that answers the question. We would need to like erase their memory if you want to compare one-to-one, right? Because that's what you do with the LLMs. They start again from scratch. It's a zero instantiation from scratch. So if I ask you to do the test 5 times without you, I would need you to forget exactly what you did the first time, which is quite impossible unless I use some tricks. Maybe under hypnosis or something.